I'm too much for you, he warned, his voice low and steady, like it had been carved out of years of hard weather and harder choices. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. The warning carried weight all on its own, settling into the air between them as the late afternoon sun slid toward the horizon. The ranch stretched wide and quiet behind him, fences running straight as promises, fields worn smooth by work, a place built on routine and restraint. This was his world, predictable, controlled, safe. She stood a few steps away, boots planted in the dust, hair pulled back against the wind. The breeze teased loose strands around her face, and she didn't bother to fix them. She'd walked a long way to get here, farther than distance alone could explain. When he looked at her, he saw someone who didn't belong in the careful order he'd made for himself. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. I don't mean it as a challenge, he continued, adjusting the brim of his hat without looking away. I've learned what happens when people get too close. His eyes, usually sharp and unreadable, flickered for just a moment, enough to reveal something buried deep. Regret, maybe, or memory. This life isn't gentle. She listened. She always did. People underestimated that about her, mistaking her quiet for softness, her stillness for hesitation. But she had learned to listen in rooms where no one cared if she understood, to weigh words that were meant to push her back. She'd heard warnings before. They all sounded the same. Concern dressed up as distance, fear disguised as strength. She took a step closer. Not fast, not careless, just enough to close the gap he'd placed between them. The dust shifted under her boot, and the sound seemed loud in the open space. He noticed it immediately, his posture tightening, shoulders drawing back like he was bracing against something unseen. You think I don't know that? She asked quietly. Her voice wasn't sharp, but it was sure. I'm not asking you to be gentle. I'm asking you to be honest. That made him pause. Honesty was a language he spoke fluently, usually with himself, rarely with anyone else. He'd built this ranch after walking away from a life that taught him how quickly things could unravel. Out here, he knew every post, every trail, every corner where shadows fell at dusk. He trusted the land because it answered to effort. People were different. People complicated things. He studied her then, really studied her. The way she held his gaze without trying to win it. The calm in her stance, like she wasn't here to take something from him, but to offer something instead. He felt a familiar instinct rise, the one that told him to draw a line and defend it. Too much, too intense, too dangerous. I don't want to break you, he said at last. She almost smiled at that, though it didn't reach her eyes. You won't, she replied. And I'm not made of glass. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass and warm earth. Somewhere, a gate creaked softly. The world went on, indifferent to the tension humming between them. He became aware of his own breathing, slower than usual, like his body was deciding something before his mind caught up. He'd expected her to back down. Most people did when he put that edge in his voice. They heard the warning and took it as an ending. She heard it as information, as truth, and instead of turning away, she leaned into it, steady and unafraid. You're too much because you hold everything in, she said gently. Because you carry it alone and call it strength. Her words weren't accusations, they were observations, spoken by someone who recognized the weight because she carried her own. For a moment, he considered ending the conversation. A sharp nod, a final word, he could retreat, into the certainty of his routine and never feel this pull again. But something about the way she stood there, open, patient, unyielding, made that feel like the greater risk. She closed the remaining distance, stopping just within his reach. He could feel the warmth of her presence now, grounding and disruptive all at once. When she leaned in and whispered, "Try me anyway," it wasn't reckless or demanding. It was an invitation rooted in trust, not bravado. The warning still hung between them, but it had changed shape. What he'd meant as a barrier had become a question, one he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ranch, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't step back. The silence that followed her words settled heavily around them, thicker than the dust in the air. He didn't move right away. The ranch had taught him patience, how to wait out storms, how to read the sky before the first drop fell. This felt like that moment, the pause before something irreversible. Her confidence pressed against him, not loud or reckless, but unyielding. It was the kind of presence that didn't demand permission, only honesty. He turned slightly, as if angling his body might give him room to think. It didn't. She was already there, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her without touching her. That awareness alone unsettled him. He had always believed distance was a shield. Now, standing this close, he realized distance had also been a hiding place. You don't understand what you're stepping into, he said, quieter now, the warning losing its edge. I don't do halfway. When I let someone in, it changes everything. His jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the effort of restraint. He was fighting something older than this moment, habits formed by loss, by mistakes that had left marks deeper than scars. She nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. I'm not asking for halfway, she replied. And I'm not asking you to change overnight. Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed steady. I just want you to stop pretending you don't feel this. That struck closer than he liked. He did feel it. The pull, the shift, the way his careful balance had tilted the moment she refused to retreat. He prided himself on control, on knowing exactly where his limits were. But she hadn't crossed a line. She'd made him question why it existed in the first place. He glanced toward the open fields, the fences catching the fading light. Everything out there made sense. You worked, you earned, you endured. Feelings didn't fit neatly into that equation. They didn't obey rules or respect boundaries. And yet here she was, standing in front of him, calm in a way that made his own certainty feel suddenly thin. You think this is bravery, he said, turning back to her. But it might just be stubbornness. She smiled faintly. Maybe, she admitted, but sometimes stubbornness is what keeps you standing when everything else tells you to leave. Her words lingered. He recognized that kind of stubbornness, the kind that got you up before dawn, that kept you fixing fences in the heat, that made you rebuild after a fire instead of walking away. He'd admired it in himself, in the land, in the animals he worked with. He'd just never expected to see it reflected back at him like this. She shifted her weight, settling into the moment instead of filling the silence. That, more than anything, changed the dynamic. She wasn't trying to rush him. She wasn't trying to win. She was simply there, unafraid of waiting. The pressure he'd braced for never came. Instead, there was room to breathe, to consider, to feel without being pushed. You're shaking things loose, he said finally, almost to himself. Good, she answered, softly. Some things are meant to be shaken loose. He let out a slow breath, the tension easing just enough for him to notice how tightly he'd been holding himself. His shoulders dropped a fraction. His stance shifted from defensive to grounded. It wasn't surrender, it was acknowledgement. He took a step closer, not invading her space, just meeting her where she stood. Their proximity felt different now, less like a challenge, more like an understanding. He could see the small details in her expression, the steadiness of her gaze, the patience in her posture, the way she seemed rooted, as if she'd already decided this moment mattered. I don't promise easy, he said. I don't even promise certainty. She didn't hesitate. I don't need promises, she replied. Just truth. That was the hardest request of all. Truth required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one thing he'd sworn off long ago. But looking at her, he realized she wasn't asking him to give it all at once. Just enough to take the next step honestly. The ranch around them grew quieter as evening settled in, shadows stretching long and soft. Somewhere in the distance, a horse shifted, the sound grounding and familiar. He found comfort in that, proof that the world wasn't ending just because his carefully ordered life had been disrupted. He met her gaze again, really met it this time. The warning he'd issued earlier still mattered, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like context. She wasn't ignoring who he was, she was choosing him with full awareness of it. All right, he said at last, the word carrying more weight than a dozen speeches. We take this slow, we take it real. Her smile this time was unmistakable, not triumphant, not relieved, just quietly certain. And as the last light faded from the sky, he realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't bracing for loss. He was allowing possibility. Night settled over the ranch with a calm that felt earned rather than assumed. The sky deepened from blue to indigo, stars emerging one by one, steady and patient. He stood there with her, the decision he'd spoken aloud still echoing in his chest. Slow, real. The words felt unfamiliar, like tools he hadn't used in years, but they fit his hands better than he expected. They walked together toward the house without touching, not out of distance but intention. The porch boards creaked beneath their steps, a sound he'd known since the day they were laid. He struck a match and lit the lamp, the warm glow filling the room with honeyed light. The familiar space, table scarred by time, chair worn smooth, looked different with her in it, as if the place itself had shifted to accommodate something new. He poured coffee, hands steady now. You should know, he said, setting the mug down, I don't move fast because I don't want to break what's good. He met her eyes, or repeat what wasn't. She took the cup, nodding. I don't want fast, she said. I want true. They sat across from each other, the table between them like a promise rather than a barrier. The quiet didn't feel awkward, it felt honest. He spoke of the years he'd spent building the ranch back from nothing, of the choices that had kept him alone, of the way solitude had once felt like strength and later like habit. He didn't dramatize it, he didn't ask for absolution. He simply told the truth. She listened the way she always had, without interrupting, without trying to fix what didn't need fixing. When he finished, she shared her own story in pieces, how she'd learned resilience the hard way, how she trusted effort over words, how she chose presence over promises. Their lives weren't mirrors, but they recognized the same lines of endurance etched into each other. At some point, the distance between them closed. A chair scraped softly, a sleeve brushed a forearm. He noticed the way his body responded, not with tension this time, but with ease. He reached for her hand, not to claim or to test, but to ground himself in the moment. She laced her fingers with his, firm and warm, a quiet agreement passing between them. I meant what I said, he murmured. I'm not easy. She squeezed his hand. Neither am I. They smiled then, small, knowing smiles, because they understood the truth beneath the words. Difficulty wasn't a threat, it was a shared language. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, steady as breath. Inside, the lamp cast long shadows that didn't feel ominous, just real. Later, they stepped back out onto the porch. The night air was cool, the stars bright. He pointed out constellations, names learned from someone long gone. She listened, leaning into the silence between his words. When she spoke, it was to ask questions that mattered, not about tomorrow's plans, but about the values that shaped them. I don't need you to be anything you're not, she said quietly. Just don't disappear when it gets hard. He considered that, the weight of it honest and fair. I won't, he said. And if I stumble, I'll say so. That was the moment it settled, not as fireworks or declarations, but as something steadier. A choice renewed in the quiet. He had warned her because he respected the truth of who he was. She had stayed because she respected it too. Between them, respect had grown into trust, and trust into something that felt durable. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the stars trace slow arcs overhead. He felt no urge to rush, no fear of losing control. The strength he'd once defined as distance had evolved into something better, presence. He realized that being too much wasn't about intensity alone, it was about depth, about caring fully and showing up honestly. When she finally turned to him, her eyes reflected the night sky. "We'll figure it out," she said. He nodded. Together, the ranch slept around them, unchanged and yet entirely new. And as the lamp inside dimmed and the stars burned brighter, he understood that the warning he'd given had become an invitation, one they'd both accepted, not with haste, but with intention.